rents and, of course, occupancy, forecast revenue, really. Are 100 new units going to be a significant catalyst for this, for new development in the surrounding area? Is that enough? And lastly, is the 1A project the best option for the city? So we've got a lot more detail in the report, but I've got a summarized response here. The clear need for new construction, very difficult to justify in this market. The rents aren't there. We don't think you remember we've got an area that's got 14% vacancy already against state and Bristol vacancies, which are lower. So that immediate trade area is showing greater vacancy. So it's hard to build new construction in an area with above average, well above average vacancy. Also very hard to get those kinds of rents. So can it be leased to the forecasted rent? Well, we would predict that there will be a very extended lease up and probably significant ongoing vacancy for some period of time. And that's going to affect market value, which affects what they can pay in taxes and so on. Will it serve as enough of a catalyst? And this is a somewhat subjective conclusion, but we believe it's just too small. 100 units isn't going to make a big difference in this overall market. It's going to help, no question. And we're certainly supporters of seeing housing built in the downtown area, big supporters of that. But we think 100 units isn't going to turn the market around. And we would caution the city in assuming that 100 units is really going to be a catalyst for a lot of other development in the area. Lastly, is it the best option? Well, we think there are probably some better options out there, and we don't like to just bring in problems. We like to give you some things to think about. We'll do that in a minute. But there's also a risk of failure here. And what failure looks like is a project that didn't get leased at the numbers that it was supposed to be achieving. There's, in addition to the city's money, there's going to be construction lending and perhaps a permanent lender on it. And the worst case scenario, of course, is the project only gets to 60% leased, and suddenly the lenders aren't getting their payments they thought they were going to get, and the project ultimately goes into foreclosure. That's the worst case scenario. And there's some risk of that. How much? Very hard to assess, but again, it's a very difficult market. So that's basically the conclusion of our analysis on their proposal. Let's talk about what we do next year. I'm getting out of order here on my slides. There we go. So what do? We've got a number of alternatives, including this phase 1 proposal. We should keep it on the table and keep talking about it. Do we recommend that the city proceed as the phase 1A proposal has been structured? In a word, no, it's not recommended. Again, we think that new construction and rents aren't supported by the market demand that's evident there. We don't think that they'll be able to achieve appropriate financial benchmarks that are needed to make this thing work financially. And in a nutshell, we don't think it's likely to be successful. So what are the other options here? A bunch of decline the current proposals, and we've given you a series of options to think about here, but they all start with declining, of course, first. And the first one is to issue a new RFP with the same criteria. Basically, the market's improved since 2010. There's a little more capital out there, a little more economic recovery on the horizon. It's a different market, pretty grim market in 2010. Still not great, but people starting to feel like there's some sunlight over the next hill 4 years later. So you could go back out to the market. That's one alternative with the same criteria. Would you get more proposals? You might. Are they going to be significantly different? We don't think so. We don't think that the result of that is likely to give you any real improvement in where you're at. So although you could decline and go back out, we don't see that as being a great option for you. You could issue a new RFP with different criteria. Maybe make the area a little bigger, change some of the criteria, try to make it a little more attractive. You've learned a lot in the last 4 years. And you can go back to the market, and again, it's a better market today than it was in 2010. And you may get some more interest if you change the criteria and make it a little, make it appeal to a little more of what the market is looking to do. But again, we're skeptical that that's going to change the outcome in a very material way. You'll probably get some opportunities, but they'll look a lot like what you're seeing from the Renaissance guys today. You can do what we call in the industry land bank it. Basically sit on the land now, you own it, and await the market recovery. Not a bad strategy in some ways. You know, the market's probably going to come back. Real estate's cyclical. I've lived through 3 down cycles. I would like to be retired before I have to live through the next one. They're not fun. But the market does cycle, comes back up, and sometimes it comes roaring back up. It takes a few years, but when it does, there's opportunity out there. So you could bank it, wait a market recovery, and you may, I'm quite sure you would get new interest. The one overarching issue on this one, the C, await the market recovery, is, again, think back to what I was talking about on the macro demography is destiny slide, where I said, you know, we're in an area with slow or no growth. Since about 1987, according to the Connecticut Economic Research Center, we've really had, in this region, we've really had no net population growth, no net business formation, and no net new employment. And I'm talking about net. In that kind of market, awaiting the market recovery is, it may not be your best bet. You know, it may not be. When the market comes back, there's a fair bit of vacancy out there now. Most of, for example, in office, most of the markets in the area are plus 20% vacant. So even if the market comes back strong in this area, which I've described as being relatively slow or no growth, what's going to happen is most of the existing vacancy is going to get absorbed before new construction starts. So you want to be a little careful about making that bet about the market recovery. But not a bad strategy necessarily. A lot of people have done very well with that. We've heard from people, let's just develop it into a traditional park. Somebody called and said, synthetic fields, that's the answer. Let's turn it into a athletic sports-based park. That's a use. We don't think it's likely to produce new economic development activity. The history of that is not to do that. It's a use that the community may need and want, and that's entirely fine. But just be careful not to assume that that's going to produce a lot of new economic activity. And lastly, develop the site into an authentic place. And this is something that's been successful in other similar situations. So we wanted to take a few minutes, and we're going to go through this fairly quickly, just give you a sense of what that means. They call it placemaking in the world that I work in. And really what it is what I've got up on the slide, is multifaceted approach to creating a public space around planning and design and management issues. It's capitalizing on the community's assets and inspirational potential. The point is to create public spaces that promote health, happiness, and well-being in the area. And it's both a process and a philosophy. It's worth studying. In this case, it may be, in fact, the most viable alternative. Properly done, placemaking really can anchor a downtown area. It can catalyze economic development in the surrounding blocks, and that's what we're trying to do here. It generates substantial pedestrian activity. It, in fact, is a well-established path now, and there are a lot of examples for where it's been used very effectively. Talking about that in the context of the original plan, if you think back, I was going to put a slide in and I didn't, but the original plan that was presented by Renaissance downtowns had a sort of Blueback Square feel to it, right? You know, it had a lot of retail, a lot of office, a lot of residential, and it had this wonderful picture of a piazza in the center of it. And it had a lot of people and color and activity and wonderful things going on here. That's sort of what we're saying about a placemaking. If you think of that plan and change your view of that and say, okay, the buildings that they showed on that plan could actually be ultimately the buildings that surround, a lot of them existing, that surround this current 17-acre site. And the piazza they envisioned could be, in fact, that 17-acre site with little or no new construction, more adaptive reuse of existing buildings, existing inventory, which is sitting vacant currently. So this placemaking, you could turn this site into this piazza that was envisioned in some of the early pictures shown by Renaissance, and then allow it to catalyze the redevelopment of the buildings in the surrounding blocks. And that has some interesting potential. And again, as I said, there's some notable examples out there for where that's worked. Downtown area housing, the occupants, potential occupants are typically drawn from these groups: the empty nester, retired couples, the dinks, the double income, no kids, the younger professional singles. Those are the groups that you're really trying to attract to residential in a downtown environment. And they ask themselves, in our work, they ask themselves sort of a standard question, and that is, can we see ourselves living here? And the way that translates, they say, if we walk out into our neighborhood, are there places for us to eat, find entertainment, other after-work activities, where we can share our interests and our choice of recreational activity? That's what they're looking for. The site, in fact, from a suitability standpoint, is a wonderful site for this kind of public venue. It's a very remarkable site. It's a striking natural setting that was noticed by all of us with this view of the mountain to the south. The focus of this would be this around design, and you really, again, you're trying to target that end user that I just mentioned, those three groups, and you want to landscape this to integrate the existing topography. You don't want to change what's there all that much. You want to use what's there to the greatest degree possible. Incorporate paths through it, bicycle and walking paths, and not simply trying to get people to transit the site, but really to make them sort of interesting and intriguing and have them draw in. Other things we would say, if you went down the path of considering this, that other examples of what we've seen work in these kinds of venues is incorporating a hill or a pond as an observation point, some exhibit areas for art and sculpture, displays, farmers markets, art shows, food tastings, antique fairs, automobile shows, and so on, food carts and trucks, music and other arts performances, outdoor public activity areas for these types of activities, yoga, dance, chess, outdoor chess and backgammon. A lot of continuing education is taught in these outdoor venues now, photography particularly. We've seen observatories and public outdoor movie nights done in them. Skating rinks are a logical one. Where do you go to talk to people about this? A lot of the corporate involvement, sponsorships, sometimes colleges, but certainly the major employers. And we've added in some suggestions around things you might tie in. The shuttle service down to ESPN from the site. One idea thrown out was can you even uncover the Paglavic River? I don't know if you can even do that. Digital display broadcast booths showcasing broadcast events. Logical with ESPN as a resident here. And generally features and programming intended to appeal to the Bristol community. So, placemaking is a thought. We'll show you some examples of that in a second. We put just one or two slides in here just to give you a little bit of a visual touch on what that could look like. But our conclusions are, really we recommend declining this current Phase 1 proposal, the financial proposal. At this point in the economic cycle, the risk is low of doing that. Time is working in your favor. The market's going to continue to improve. You may decide just to let it improve and keep looking and perhaps keep talking to the Renaissance people, and maybe a better plan will come forward. The overall market is going to continue to improve with that caveat that I gave you about being in a slow growth market, but it will continue to improve over time. While you're sitting and working with either Renaissance or looking at other ideas, spend some time on this placemaking idea on the public facility. It can act as a catalyst for economic development in the surrounding blocks. So you're not adding new construction. What you're trying to do is incentivize or encourage reconstruction, redevelopment, adaptive reuse of the existing built environment surrounding the site itself. And you really want to spend a little time looking at what examples are out there so that you can incorporate the best designs that are available for public spaces. Third recommendation, do a detailed inventory of these surrounding buildings and sites. Again, we really think the market struggles to justify ground-up new construction in almost any asset class, and certainly in the case of residential. We'd encourage the city to really work hard at what can be done with the surrounding buildings and the owners of those buildings come up with their viability or identify their viability for residential housing development. It might well be the Renaissance folks would be interested in doing that in one of the existing buildings. But the goal is to create a mix in the surrounding area, a mix of housing types at different price points and different ownership and rental structures and different architectural styles and so on. Recommendation number four, implement a comprehensive investment strategy for downtown and surrounding blocks. And this takes a couple of things, takes form in a couple of things. Really looking at the existing properties that we mentioned, targeting them for renovations and improving the standards of maintenance around the ones that are occupied. Doing a lot of community outreach around this issue, what can be done with the existing built environment. It may take intensifying the code enforcement. You may want to consider establishing things like a low-interest home improvement loan fund, landscape and architectural design assistance, block-level strategies aimed at raising the standards. And lastly, encourage the development or redevelopment of the mix of housing types in the surrounding blocks. Recommendation number five, create a notable and comprehensive set of regulatory and financial incentives. The goal is to encourage what we've talked about, this mix of housing types, as we described. What we like to see communities do to turn around the direction they've been heading on economic development is really implement a comprehensive simplification of their land use regulatory environment. And the mantra that you'll hear us refer to is make your regulatory environment three things. Swift, you want it to happen quickly. It shouldn't take years for project approvals to be done. You want to make it as simple as you can stand, and that means as few boards and commissions, as few layers of review. We encourage you to let your professional staff do a lot more on an administrative level. The goal is to attract investment capital to your community, and you have to make it easy for people to do that if you're going to get it. Make it hard to put money to work in your community and you won't get it. So part of respecting that investment capital is make that regulatory environment swift, simple, and certain. Make it easy, swift to get through the process, simple process, and the last one is certain. Remove things. We see communities, for example, that have everything in a given area as a special permit. That's just a real block to getting things done. And when real estate investors look at that, or national firms look at opening a business in that, when they see that sort of discretion, they're just not going to spend the time and effort to chase things for a year to get a location open, only to find that the permit gets denied at the last night. So make the environment swift, simple, and certain. Create an approval process. That's what I was talking about, that 9C, swift, simple, and certain. Examples of programs. These are just a few of many. There's a whole toolkit out there. Don Poland and Rob Rowson can do a lot better job than I can on this. But tax abatements on incremental increases in value from renovation and improvements. Financing for improvements and renovations that can be paid back by the increase in taxes. Density bonuses. 30-day site plan review. Reduced or waived building permit fees. These are only a few of the things that are potential tools. So that's the 5 recommendations. And here's some slides just to get you thinking about this whole business of placemaking. Indianapolis, IMA, great, wonderful public venue. Des Moines Art Center, again, wonderful. They really engage the corporate community in terms of sponsoring sculptures in this park. It's now become a park that attracts people from far and wide around the area to see it, and they put a lot of activities underway in that park, music and so on. Bryant Park, some of you may know, and I know we're not Manhattan, we don't have the density and so on that Manhattan has, but have a look at the Bryant Park website when you get a chance. Just Google Bryant Park in Manhattan. Wonderful website, and here's some of the examples of the things they've done. You see the skating rink up in the upper left, the classes, yoga classes, the dance classes they teach, and some of the outdoor media events, display events, and so on. So wonderful places. They add a lot of quality to the community, and in fact, we know that they can be a very effective catalyst for further economic development. People want to live next to these kinds of venues, and we think that it's a potential option that deserves some study in the situation that you find yourself in today. So that's not bad. I said I'd be about an hour, and we're through it. I hope that was helpful. and I encourage you, again, as the mayor said, the full report is up on the website. Have a look at it. If you're having trouble sleeping, dive into the data. That'll fix that very quickly. But this gives you a pretty good overview. If you go to the website, what I would encourage you to do is focus on the summary. The summary is about 14 or 15 pages. It gets a little heavy. This is kind of the overview of that summary. But it'll fill in some of the details, perhaps answer some of the questions that you might have. So, thank you. Mayor?
Thank you. Let me thank you for your report. First, let me say that, let me remind everyone again that tonight is just the first meeting. We will have a public session where the public and Renaissance will be able to talk on these points. We all have a lot to read and a lot to digest, but at this point I'm going to ask the council if you have any questions right now. Otherwise, we are going to be having another meeting, but if you have any questions now, I'll start on my left and we'll work our way down. Calvin?
Okay, well, the first thing is, Mayor, could you say again when in September that meeting?
Right now, it's tentatively September 15th at 7:30, but it has not been posted.
Okay. All right, wanted to make sure. So right now is questions.
Just from the council to Mr. Goman. And again, you don't have to ask a question. We just took a lot in.
Right. Okay. It's hard for me to phrase some of what I have to say in a question. All right, skip me for now.
And let me remind the council that we are going to executive session, so the financial parts, we'll talk in executive session on the finance parts.
No questions.
Councilman?
No questions.
Councilman? Councilman?
Yeah, I just have a couple of thoughts. On the geotechnical assessment, that could be costly, correct?
Yeah, it can be. I've forgotten the acreage of that site, but
17 acres.
well, the area that they would build on is probably all they would test. But 20,000, 30,000 would be probably not a bad number. Depends on what they find and whether that they have to do deeper analysis or more analysis.
And another problem you mentioned also, if the interest rates are rising, that could be another problem to work for, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And the gap on rentals is quite a bit. So, the gap presented on the rentals, what Renaissance projected, and what you said, it could be a big difference.
Yeah, if it was a 30 or 40 cent per square foot difference, that's a big gap.
Yeah. And my last thought was, if it was to work, I think there should be a combination of retail and also could be a combination of housing. That's what I would like to see.
And I think they included in the report about 10,000 feet of retail on the ground floor. We didn't have a hard look at that. That's really not a lot of retail. That's a couple of small uses, coffee shop and so on.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilwoman?
Yes, Mayor. I just have a brief question. I know that we're going to get the report at some point, and we'll probably have a lot of that data included, but it would be important for me to just get a brief overview to talk about some of the data sources that you used. I'm specifically interested in the ones that relate to the rental and the vacancy rates, how you drew on those. Because frankly, in some of your data that you talked about, which I agree with your data as it was presented, but that's not necessarily the rental rates that we were looking to keep in this area. So I guess my question to you is, based on your analysis, how do we as a community maybe replace the plan to increase that level of market rate? Because I think that was part of our end goal.
Yeah, you're right, it is. Just on the data sources, we do both pure and sort of applied data research. I guess the best way to explain that is the pure side is available data from things like the American Community Survey, what we all call the census. They report rents. We use that. We use MLS data. We use data available on rental from industry associations or sometimes brokerage houses. And we tend to pull, in a case like this, we tend to pull data from 5 or 6 different sources and then compare it. The other thing you have to do at the end of the day is you have to get on the phone and actually call some of the projects and find out what they're actually renting for. So we do all that. But you're right, the goal here is not to really replace the current market level. The question is, can you jump it up from the current market levels that we showed, somewhere around $650 a month, most of which, or most of it was below $800 a month, for example. Can you make that leap up to $1,100 a month for a studio and $1,500 a month for a one-bedroom? That is a big leap, a very big leap. We think that that's very, very difficult to do when all you're really going to do is sort of airdrop a new 100-unit building on the south end of the site, and that's it. I don't think that's a compelling enough story to make that rent jump from the rents that are currently being obtained in the market to these new rents as much as you'd like it. There's got to be a lot more going on around it before you can get to that kind of rent level. Now, if you combined it with something like we described in this placemaking and let that come along and mature a little bit, and you eventually did ground-up construction nearby, might you get to that level? It's possible, but there's a lot of ground that's got to be covered between where we are today and that point.
And just one other quick question from a global viewpoint of the experience that you've had where communities have been successful with placemaking. How do they integrate that with potential other community assets and not have it as a negative? For example, I'm thinking about the significant improvements and investment that we've made in our park system, several of which were very close within your DTTA statistics. So how do we not off-balance what we've already done in certain community asset areas with this, number one? And the second point is, in your professional opinion, where have you seen this work and what has that management structure been? Who manages a site like this?
Well, your first question, whether it will cannibalize existing public spaces, I think the answer to that is really you've got to get it done, designed, and planned correctly so that it doesn't do that. Will there be some transference of some of the activities? There may be, but there is a sort of a greater good I think you're trying to serve by creating a lot of activity in the downtown area that will spin off economic benefit. But the answer to your first question is good planning and design will help you get it right so that you don't end up cannibalizing and just create a duplicate. That serves no one well if all you do is create a duplicate of what is out there now. In terms of communities that have done this, we have a long list of ones. There are some in the report, and we can give you more of those. There are a couple of great websites, organizations one is called the Project for Public Spaces, and there's another one that it's all in the book that you will see online. But there are a number. If you type in placemaking and Google that, you'll see a whole long list of where it's been applied. And you had a second part of that question. Just
what have you seen as a management structure?
Oh, management structure, yeah. I think it runs the gamut from volunteer organizations that are really community-based to ones that are driven by the local Parks and Rec department to ones that are driven by private companies, so to speak, or not-for-profit companies. Like Bryant Park, for example, is actually set up as a not-for-profit corporation that has its own volunteer board of trustees that run it. They get corporate sponsorship, they get presumably some money from the city, and they run the park. And that may be a model that works well in this case.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Your Honor, I've got a couple. So following up on Councilor Zappa's question there about other places that have done placemaking, you showed us Des Moines and Indianapolis and New York. Off the top of your head, can you recall any places that are more akin or comparable to Bristol that have been able to do this and make it work?
I'm sure they're out there. We didn't spend a lot of time trying to look at that. What we really wanted to do tonight was not tell you this is what you should do, but give it to you as an idea to think about. We can find that, though.
All right. And then my second question that I had was, I remember earlier on in the presentation, you made the point that you did not feel like 100 units, residential units, was a sufficient catalyst. So is the implication there that you believe more is needed, or more will be needed after X, Y, and Z happens first? Because you also made the point that you didn't feel like 100 units would really be able to be rented right away, and that there would be long periods of vacancy.
Well, so keep in mind that rental rate.
And that rental rate.
But yeah, you're right. The 100 units just aren't enough to catalyze new restaurants, new retail, new services moving in. The reality is that you really need to start getting up to a sort of 1,000 new residents and above before you really start to create enough new economic activity where a restaurant will open, or another coffee shop will open, or a doctor or dentist or someone will decide there's a market there for them to operate their business nearby. So generally speaking, if you're below 1,000 new residents, it becomes questionable. When you get down to 100 units and you start talking about probably less than 200 people in total, you're really not, that's a very small number of people to put into a market like this and expect that it's going to have a noticeably positive effect in terms of new economic development.
Right. Hold on, there might be a second one, or a third one rather. Oh, yeah. Did you, in your research, come up with any numbers of how many of these existing buildings around Depot Square how many of them are vacant, or how many units are vacant?
We just looked at the overall vacancy. As I said, it's 14%, which is sort of double what the rest of Bristol is overall. Right. But no, that wasn't part of our charge. That's a fairly detailed.
Do you know how that compares to other towns that are undergoing downtown revitalization?
I don't off the top of my head, no. In terms of vacancy rate?
In the downtown, as they try to...
I'd be guessing. We can easily pull that data together.
Well, is there a formula that we should be cognizant of as we discuss new development next to or in relation to existing development that has not so great occupancy rate, or whatever it would be? Is there a specific...
Well, no, there's no specific formula. There's this kind of research. Anytime you're going to do redevelopment, let's say someone decided to come in and redevelop one of the existing buildings, they would want to do very similar research to what we've done. And in fact, their lender and their equity partners are probably going to insist that they do this kind of research, this kind of underwriting, if you will. So if you said, I'm going to buy a building downtown and come up with a plan to renovate it into new housing units, you're going to have to go to a bank for a construction loan. The bank's going to want this kind of research showing what the market demand is. And one of the key elements is going to be, what's the current market rent and what do you need to make this thing make sense? That kind of gap. No lender is going to say, oh yeah, you can do that. You can get 40 or 50% more rent.
I can understand that.
So,
I mean, that's a point that we've heard made to us before, so I can appreciate that.
Okay.
But in your professional opinion, is this a 14% vacancy rate? Did I get that right? Did I identify that correctly? That is something that should hinder our pursuit of new development? Is that the point?
Yeah, look, it's going to be a big obstacle. No one likes to build more square footage in a market that already has well above average vacancy rate.
Okay.
So what you really need to do is you need to give people a reason to live downtown.
All right.
Give them something to do, and that's sort of the point of placement. Give them a reason that they want to come downtown. If you think back to the slide with the essential question,
right.
Am I going to want to live here? That's the question. If you give them a reason to live here and you're successful, the vacancy rate will come down. When the vacancy rate comes down and there's something really notable here, people that do development for the living are going to say, all right, the vacancy is under the average.
Okay, that makes sense.
The market's tightened up. Look at this wonderful venue. People want to live next to that. I'm going to find a building or a site nearby and redevelop it. That's what you're trying to create. That's the dynamic.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Seeing none, then can I have a motion to convene to executive session for discussion of the negotiations and finances? And in there, I'd like to invite Attorney Oland, Jen and John, the Chair and Vice Chair of BDDC, as well as ask Mike Goman if he could stick around and maybe called in.
So move.
Second.
Motion made, second. Discussion. Hearing none. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you.